Go. 10.
They took man into space,
We have liftoff.
but never left the Earth.
Eagle Houston, you're go for landing, over.
They flew every flight
Hang on.
from right here on the ground.
We had to pull missions literally out of the fire, make the right things happen, and bring these crews back home.
They are the men of mission control, engineers who took the dream of spaceflight and made it reality.
It's one small step for man.
You just didn't say, we can't do this, we can't do that. You made it happen.
Flight Director Gene Kranz and the men of Mission Control tell their story for the first time.
Capcom word, no go.
And I almost shook my head in fear.
We were losing our oxygen.
Houston, we've had a problem.
The CIA came rushing in.
No one was to talk about it. No one was to know about it.
They were trapped.
You cannot operate in this room unless you believe you're a Superman and whatever happens, you're capable of solving the problem.
History was made in this room. Apollo Mission Control in Houston. It's silent now, but there was a time when it hummed with electricity. From this console, Flight Director Gene Kranz led his controllers in life and death struggles, landing on the moon for the first time,
That's one small step.
bringing a crippled ship safely home.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Fate brought Gene Kranz to this place, made him an actor on this stage. The long journey that put him here began years earlier with a young boy's dream. The dream of flight.
I had been standing in the tops of trees, and I just sway back and forth. And this was part of this adventure kind of thing. My brother-in-law got one of the pilots in there to give me a ride, and it was just like I died and gone to heaven. I was an eagle. I was soaring. I was flying. That day, it just captured me, and it's never left me.
The young boy's dream would soon come true, but the silver wings that would carry Gene Kranz aloft were born not of laughter, but fire. In 1949, the Soviet Union explodes a nuclear bomb. America and the Soviets become locked in a terrifying standoff, a Cold War. The two sides appear evenly matched, but on October the 4th, 1957, America suffers a stunning defeat. Gene Kranz is an Air Force pilot in Korea when he gets the news.
We came down from a flight one day, and we got the word that the Soviet Union had launched a satellite called Sputnik.
Russia already has nuclear weapons. Now they have the world's first satellite, an unstoppable machine flying directly over the U.S. Can it spy, take pictures? Can it drop a bomb? 4 weeks later, another Sputnik. A hostile power is advancing into space, perhaps to control the planet.
It is quite possible that an aggressor nation that dominates space will then dominate the world. We just can't let that happen.
Overnight, Russia has made space the new battlefield in the Cold War. To compete, America creates NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Its mission, fly an American in space as soon as possible. This campaign will be led not by generals, but by engineers. At any other time, these men would have had unremarkable careers. Now, world events have put them at the center of a desperate struggle. Few will ever be known to the public, but they will become the unsung heroes of the race to the moon. After leaving the Air Force, Gene Kranz joins this new army of engineers and meets a man who will shape his life, Christopher Columbus Kraft.
He was the mentor, the teacher, the tutor. Chris Kraft was the architect not only of mission control, but basically the entire concept for spaceflight operations.
Kraft is charged with designing the flight plan for Project Mercury, the program to fly an American into space.
I don't think that suddenly some morning I woke up and said, oh, we're going to have a mission control center. That term never crossed my mind. It wasn't until I began to think about the details that I realized the importance that the ground would play in this operation.
Doctors don't know if a human will be able to function in space. And even if he can, the machine will be moving too fast for the pilot to make decisions.
Kraft recognized that flying a spacecraft 5 miles per second really doesn't allow much time for equivocation. And we'd be the guys on the ground who had to come up with the answers if they ran into problems.
It's a revolutionary concept, flight control from the ground. The idea is straightforward, but it's never been done. As they start trying to make it reality, the details raise more and more questions.
How often do you want to talk to this thing as it goes around the Earth? What do you need to know where it is? If I've got to be prepared to bring it down any place around the world, what am I going to do about that?
Since communication satellites don't yet exist, Kraft will need a global network of ground stations to track the spacecraft and talk to the astronaut.
How do they know what's going on? How do they know what to do? There needed to be a place where decisions had to be made and distributed. Now, my goodness, I do need a central facility.
That facility will soon become Mercury Control. While Kraft's team is planning it, other NASA engineers at Cape Canaveral, Florida, are facing challenges of their own.
Lights on. 30 seconds, Bart.
Space is a political contest. To some, America's embarrassing rocket failures are symbolic of national weakness.
The question was whether we in the United States had really fallen behind in science and technology, not just in the space program.
On April 12, 1961, the Russians drive the point home.
The spaceship was built in Russia. The takeoff and the landing somewhere in Russia. The name of the man, Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin.
When Yuri Gagarin becomes the first man in space, it is the biggest Russian triumph since Sputnik.
They secured these large boosters, which have led to their putting their man in space. We are, I hope, going to be able to carry out our efforts this year, but we are behind.
When the Russians flew first, now the pressure on the United States was probably tenfold what it was before that.
May 5th, 1961. Newly completed Mercury Control will attempt to send astronaut Alan Shepard into space. Shepard's flight can't match the Soviets. He won't even reach orbit. But it will be done live, in full view of the world.
Somebody said to me, we're going to have this operation done as it happens on national television. And, you know, I almost shook my head in fear because that's something I'd never been faced with before.
2129 north, longitude 6048. What was the first? The first one was 108. Latitude.
There is flame on the distance. There goes the red star.
Shepard's flight will last only 15 minutes, but it's 15 minutes of pure unknowns, and the future of the entire program is riding on the outcome.
Shepard's flight was literally fraught with danger, and it was the one that we had to make happen if we were to keep moving forward in space.
Cabin pressure is holding 5.5.
Now they are absolutely screaming. It is a tremendously successful.
Apparently, Alan Shepard is in excellent condition.
The Russians are still ahead, but they fly in secret. Launching Alan Shepard on live television gives America an edge in the battle for world opinion.
Even 24 hours after that flight, we already knew that that flight had had a remarkable impact in Europe. Even though we didn't achieve what Gagarin did, the fact that we did it live and people could see it happen had a tremendous impact. And I think it was very reassuring to the Europeans to see the inside of mission control on TV, and it showed that we did still have capability.
Shepard's flight made it happen for the team. It was only 15 minutes, but it was a precursor of the great things that would come.
The political prestige of even this 15-minute success is not lost on the president. On May 25, 1961, John Kennedy ups the ante.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single
I couldn't believe it. This whole idea of doing it before this decade is out is absolutely ludicrous. And then you think about it a little bit more and you get away from the initial impressions and you say, holy cow, what a challenge, what a job. This guy trusts us when we haven't been able to put a man in orbit.
The first American to attempt an orbital flight will be astronaut John Glenn.
We will pick up the count at T-minus 6 minutes and 30 seconds.
February 20th, 1962. Our first orbital mission.
Emergency cancel? No. All pre-start panel lights are correct. The ready light is on. 1, 0. Roger, the clock is operating. Godspeed, John.
Glenn's flight will shape the future of mission control in ways no one expects. Through the first orbit, everything goes as planned.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine.
Then a warning light in mission control indicates a problem with the spacecraft.
We had a single piece of instrumentation that indicated his heat shield might have come loose. If this was true, we couldn't re-enter safely. It was also the question, was this a valid piece of information?
If it is valid, John Glenn could burn up during re-entry. Flight director Chris Kraft believes it's a false alarm.
I talked it over with my flight control team, and we all said, that's an erroneous signal. So I'll ignore that.
Then management gets involved.
In the top management's mind, restraining the heat shield with the retro-rocket package was the most conservative form of re-entry.
Normally, the retro rockets fire to begin re-entry, then drop away. Management thinks keeping the pack on through re-entry may hold the heat shield in place. But this is risky. Re-entering with it on could damage a perfectly good heat shield.
If it was not valid, then we put John Glenn at risk by using an off-the-wall procedure, one that we hadn't fully tested.
Management insists. Shortly before retrofire, John Glenn gets the news.
We are recommending that you leave the retro package on is Friendship 7. What is the reason for this? Do you have any reason? Over. Not at this time.
Glenn begins re-entry. For 4 minutes, no one will know if he has survived.
20 seconds to Retro 5.
February 20th, 1962. Astronaut John Glenn is re-entering the atmosphere at 17,000 miles an hour. A warning light says his heat shield is loose, but it may be a false alarm. For 4 minutes, Mercury Control won't know if he has survived because of radio blackout.
Blackout is a time period where the fire of re-entry prevents communications to the crewman on board the spacecraft. During this period of time, we're unable to communicate with the crewman. He's on his own.
Friendship 7, this is Cape. Do you read? Over. Friendship 7, this is Cape. Over. This is Cape. Do you read? Over. Main chute is on green.
Finally, Glenn reappears. Safe.
Friendship 7, ready for impact. Almost down. Here we go.
The signal was false. Later examination reveals the heat shield was never loose.
What did I learn from that? I learned that my organization probably knew more about the dangers associated with what we were doing, probably knew better what to do than anybody else.
From now on, Kraft insists one man will have the final say, the flight director.
It was essential that the flight director was the ultimate authority. And Chris Kraft made sure that that was the way it was, and that means that any of his bosses, even up to the NASA administrator, even up to the president, cannot reverse a decision that he makes in real time.
When you step into that console, you accept the responsibility for the lives of the crew, the success of the mission, and you're doing it in full view of the entire world.
Over the next year and a half, 3 more flights proved the concept of ground control. Project Mercury has shown America can compete in space.
Mercury was the acid test for manned spaceflight. We had to learn how to do that, and Mercury did it.
Then, on November 22nd, 1963, the man who has given the engineers of Mission Control their biggest challenge is cut down.
After his assassination, it moved from being a challenge to literally a crusade. This was now our mission to win this battle for President Kennedy. It was visceral, it was gut. We are going to do it, and we're the right people to do it, and we're going to do it in the time frame he said we'll do it.
But they won't do it without people. Lots of them. To get to the moon, NASA will need legions of engineers.
We didn't have to hire people. They came to us. They came to us in droves. And most of the young people that came to us were the first in their families ever to go to college.
We were all about the same age. We all graduated within a year or two of one another. We were all 22, 23 years old.
I was trying to build up a herd of Herefords because I thought I wanted to be a rancher. A friend says, why don't you send in an application? So the next thing I knew, they didn't even grant me an interview. They sent me a job offer for more money than a country boy had ever seen, by the way. I'll never forget what it was. It was $6,770, $6,770 a year.
We didn't have many PhDs. We didn't have many master's degrees. We had guys with BSs, with a lot of common sense, who were very adaptable, in a lot of cases were brilliant, who fit into this control center environment.
A new control center is built near Houston, Texas. Officially named the Mission Operations Control Room, MOCR, to the public it will come to be known as Mission Control. In this room, the idea of ground control will grow and be perfected. The concept is simple. Divide the spacecraft and mission into parts. Each controller will handle one part. Those in the front row, the trench, navigate, controlling where the spacecraft is and where it's going. Theirs is a world of orbital mechanics, physics, the laws of motion.
Their job was the mathematics of space. Their job was to take these equations that were put into computers, find a way to get us into orbit, and then get us back home.
The second row, systems, watches over the machine. Engines, computers, batteries, oxygen, everything it needs to function and keep the astronaut alive.
The systems row was about power systems, environmental control, oxygen, that kind of stuff. Very different kind of culture and usually different kinds of thinkers.
The room is a pyramid. At the top sits the flight director. Controllers give him information. He makes the decisions. If Mission Control is an orchestra, the flight directors, Chris Kraft, John Hodge, Glenn Lunny, Gene Kranz, and all who follow, they are the conductor.
The flight director's job is to take any actions needed for crew safety and mission success. I have between 15 and 21 controllers in this room who provide me inputs, but ultimately I have to exercise the mission decision.
Mission Control will be made of more than wires, buttons, and screens. This room develops its own culture, and fitting in starts with learning the language.
You want Omni Bravo?
I was staying at one of my friend's house, and she said, well, how was your first day? I said, it was really exciting and fine. I said, except I might as well have been in a foreign country. I didn't know what anybody was talking about.
GNC, give me a RCS propellant consumed so far. It looks like a PCM count from 302.
It was all acronyms. I mean, and then there was acronyms of acronyms.
ECS Econ. Go. I think we may have some RCS, huh? Roger.
On UHF, the Ecom's going to talk about the EPD CDS and what relationship it might have to GNC and whether or not that will cause us to abort the mission and go into the Tanana Reef. That kind of stuff.
I'm going to lose it. Okay.
Acronyms are just the beginning. Each console connects to 25 phone lines or loops. Controllers must learn to decipher multiple conversations at once.
One of the things you learned to do was to be able to listen to 3 and 4 and sometimes 5 loops at one time. And you'd be picking out what you had to know and what you wanted to hear and what you didn't want to hear.
Okay. It's going down. It's going down. Thank you. Hang around the fuel. Search tank slow down. We blew the man. Flight Econ. Flight Econ.
You'd learn how to pick it out. Either that or you'd probably just drown in the job.
Let's try flight.
The young men who come to Mission Control in the 60s, and they are all men, live in an engineer's paradise. Intense, high-tech, competitive, and insulated. Outside, an American cultural revolution will soon begin brewing. As the 60s unfold, Mission Control will be many things. One thing it will never be is hip.
They were all had button-down white shirts, narrow ties, and of course the pocket protectors there for the pens and the pencils.
First of all, for the record, I'd never owned a pocket protector.
I never wore one in my life.
I didn't either.
Other people did, but I never owned one.
Mine was leather, but I had one.
Working in Mission Control will change their lives forever. It's not a healthy environment, but with the coffee, cigarettes, junk food, and stress comes a sense of identity, love for the job, and pride that in a crisis, their country is counting on them.
When the picture finally opened up to me about what this was about, I really got into it, and I was hooked.
I didn't give a shit what I'd been thinking, how many problems I got when I walked through those doors and I shut them behind me. I was now in the control center, and I'd better get my act together because what I was going to be doing is very important.
The Russians surprised with another first in the person of Alexei Leonov, who they say became the first man to walk around in space.
On March 18, 1965, the world is reminded that Russian engineers, not Americans, are making the important breakthroughs.
Russia has moved ahead of the U.S. once more in the race for the moon.
In the top levels of the White House and in the Congress, there was deep concern that all the important things were being done first by the Soviet. They were the first ones to orbit anything. They were the first ones to put man in space. They were the first ones to put a woman in space. Again and again and again, they were doing things first. And when were we going to be able to do something first?
NASA's answer is Project Gemini. Flying a two-man spacecraft not much bigger than Mercury, Gemini will develop the tools and techniques to reach the moon, hopefully before the Russians.
Gemini was designed to develop and prove the operational techniques of a rendezvous, long-duration missions, and then a spacewalk, extravehicular operations.
None of these is more crucial than rendezvous. The Russians have never done it, and it will be essential to lunar missions. Leaving the moon, the lunar lander will have to rendezvous with the mother ship, or the astronauts won't get home.
Rendezvous was an absolute necessity if we were to achieve the goal of putting a man on the moon.
Rendezvous, bringing two vehicles close together in space, won't be easy. Each one is moving 17,000 miles an hour, faster than a rifle bullet. Getting them on the same path within a few feet of each other without crashing will be the most complex maneuver ever attempted. A president's pledge, billions of dollars of hardware, years of work by tens of thousands of people, all for nothing if rendezvous doesn't work. December 1965. For 8 years, America has been behind in space. Now Mission Control is trying to beat Russia with the world's first rendezvous.
Rendezvous was an absolute necessity if we were to achieve the goal of putting a man on the moon.
Gemini 6, with astronauts Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford, launches. They will attempt to rendezvous with Gemini 7, flown by Frank Borman and Jim Lovell, already in orbit. Success or failure comes down to math.
With a gravitational constant.
The orbital mechanics in the trench have to calculate two perfect trajectories, figuring the Earth's gravity, the spacecraft's weight, the rocket's power, all the variables. If their equations work, they'll wind up with two speeding bullets perfectly positioned alongside each other, like two cars tailgating a foot apart at 17,000 miles an hour. No one knows if it can work.
We had to prove that these equations that they had written could bring those two together.
Okay. Steering looks good from here, Gemini 6. You are go.
We calculated all the maneuvers they had to do. We tracked their orbits, and in essence, kind of flew the spacecraft from the ground.
Gemini 6, Houston, you're coming up on 1 minute to the burn. Roger, Jim. Mark.
The moment of truth. If the trench's calculations are right, Schirra and Stafford in Gemini 6 should be able to spot 7 a few miles ahead.
Hey, I think I've got it. Is that spacecraft 7?
Ed Fendell is a controller at the Hawaii tracking station.
And I had two vehicles sitting there, and they were talking to each other because they had rendezvoused right over the top of me. And it was very, very exciting.
Yeah, we're sitting up here playing bridge together. We're in formation with 7. Everything is go here.
Rendezvous is the first time America has beaten the Russians. Jerry Bostic wants to celebrate.
I went to the flight director, Chris Kraft, and said, would you mind if we broke out some American flags and showed a little emotion in the control center? And not only did we put them on the console, I have to admit, we got a little excited and we waved them around.
It's 1965. The dual mission of Gemini 7-6 is a triumph. The only technique remaining to be mastered is spacewalking, what the engineers call extravehicular activity, EVA. A year earlier, astronaut Ed White's 15-minute spacewalk had gone well. Now America's second EVA, far more ambitious, will be up to astronaut Gene Cernan.
Cernan would have to move along a series of handholds to a maneuvering unit that he would strap on his back, and he would basically fly around the vicinity on the tether behind the Gemini spacecraft.
June 5th, 1966, Gemini 9. 49 plus hours into the flight, a little over 1/2 hour into America's second EVA.
Everyone expects Cernan's EVA to be easy, but in zero gravity, he has trouble. He can barely control his movements.
All my energy went into trying to stay in one position and anchor my body. Every time I'd make a motion to do that, my body would go in the other direction. I'd turn a valve and a valve would turn me.
In a stiff suit with nothing to hold on to, it becomes an extreme workout.
And just listening on the ground, you can hear the labored breathing. He's just breathing hard.
The flight surgeon watches Cernan's pulse climb over 170 beats a minute. What if he passes out or has a heart attack? There's not a thing Mission Control can do.
I really realize how powerless we are. I can visualize Gene in this environment, but basically there's no way I can help him.
I didn't want them to do it. If it was up to me, we wouldn't do EVAs. Okay, it was a dangerous thing to do. It's very dangerous to get out because you may not come back.
Finally, Stafford and Cernan agree to call it quits.
The crew decided they would abort the EVA while they were out of sight of Mission Control.
It was scary. When they got that hatch closed and we could see the pressure in the cabin start coming up, everybody, it was a little bit of a, whew, glad that's over.
We had to take an entirely new approach to extravehicular operations.
The answer was surprisingly simple. Study and train for EVAs underwater, where gravity is neutralized. Neutral buoyancy training, still in use today, leads to new tools, handholds, foot restraints that make all the difference. In November 1966, Gemini 12 executes a perfect spacewalk. In Gemini, Mission Control has mastered rendezvous, learned to fly 2 spacecraft at once, and recovered from near disaster with EVA.
Gemini was the confidence builder. It gave our industry time to learn how to build these space systems, but it was the confidence builder for the planners, the operators in this room, and the astronauts.
Not too many people remember Gemini today, but it was Gemini that taught us the techniques we would need for Apollo.
Apollo, the program that will send men on a 500,000-mile journey. With 3 years left to the end of the decade and John Kennedy's deadline, everyone is working around the clock.
We used to be working 16, 18 hours a day. You'd work 6, 7 days a week. You automatically worked every Saturday. That was the world we lived in.
That's go fever. It's
other inputs that make you want to do things beyond the good logic you have. We suffered Go fever many times because of that commitment to Mr. Kennedy.
Go fever has become a way of life at NASA. With the first Apollo flight only weeks away, nothing is ready.
There just weren't enough hours in the day to get all the things done that we needed to. And we kept pressing the schedule, we kept pressing the time, we kept pressing in every direction.
The Apollo 1 crew, Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and Ed White, are racing too. And they're frustrated with the spacecraft.
The Apollo was a mess. It had a lot of things that had not been tested. It was shipped to the Cape, not ready to go. So we lived with that damn thing around the clock.
January 27, 1967, 3 weeks to launch. A dress rehearsal of the final countdown called the Plugs Out test. The crew is sealed in, the spacecraft pumped up with high-pressure oxygen.
Okay, we've tried about every mode. I don't know what to do, buddy.
The test drags on into the evening.
I remember that day we just couldn't talk with the crew. The communication was just terrible.
How about Flight? How do you get to learn? We can't talk between three buildings. I don't know what to do, buddy. I can't hear a thing you're saying. Jesus Christ.
We're literally behind in every area of our work. And nobody stood up and said, stop.
At 6:31 p.m. on a Friday evening, Go fever finally catches up with NASA. For those who are a part of Apollo, its history lives in two halves. The dividing line between them, January 27, 1967. That Friday, here at Pad 34, everything changed.
Exactly John, but I remember Carl Huss talking about
Even
it.
today, when Gene Kranz and his controllers get together, the conversation always returns to that night. They call what happened the fire, and none of them will ever forget it.
I had gotten off shift with Gene that day, and several of us had gone over to the Holiday Inn, and we were over there drinking.
I had gone home because they were going out for the evening, and one of my neighbors came over who worked out at the Space Center and indicated they had had a fire in the pad.
Okay, we didn't copy anybody. Easy fire?
I thought to myself, this could be really serious, because the first thing that came into my mind was 100% oxygen. Fire was the last thing you ever wanted to hear if you're operating with oxygen. And they couldn't get out. They were trapped.
And that was the end of it. It was all over in about 12 seconds.
Trapped in a cockpit fire, Ed White, Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee are dead. For many young controllers, the fire is their first experience with death. For everyone in NASA, it marks the end of their innocence.
This started, I would say, probably the most difficult week in our
year.
history.
Well,
but
a lot of guys
a process. Get through that first week. Get over that.
Come back to work.
First barrier. Get back to work. Figure out what are you going to do about it.
Monday morning after the fire, Gene Kranz speaks to the team. Decades later, he can still recite the words from that day.
Spaceflight's terribly unforgiving of carelessness, incapacity, or neglect. I don't know what the Thompson Committee will find as the cause of this accident, but I know what I find. We were the cause. The simulators weren't ready. Our software and mission control didn't function. Procedures weren't complete. Nothing we did had any shelf life. And no one stood up and said, "Damn it, stop." Now, from this day forward, mission control will be known by two words: tough and competent. Tough meaning we will never again shirk from our responsibility because we're forever accountable for what we do or what we fail to do. Competent, we'll never again take anything for granted. We'll never stop learning. When you leave here today, you will write these two words, tough and competent, on your blackboard, and they will never be erased. They will serve as a constant reminder to the sacrifice of Grissom, White, and Chaffee. That's all.
And then I remember walking out of there and people starting to gather in little groups and starting to talk. And I think our whole attitude changed, and I think we changed. I think we then took the challenge to go make things right.
NASA convenes a board of review, the Thompson Committee. They find the fire began with a short circuit somewhere in 30 miles of wire. They also find shoddy workmanship by the contractor. Too much flammable material in the cabin, a hatch that cannot be opened quickly, and the terrible danger of pure oxygen. All manned flights are grounded indefinitely. Faced with a disaster that could have ended Apollo, NASA pulls off an engineering triumph. In less than 2 years, the spacecraft is redesigned, rebuilt, and ready to fly.
October 11, 1968, Apollo 7. Return to manned flight testing. The shakedown cruise of the redesigned command and service module.
21 months after the fire, Apollo 7 astronauts Don Isley, Wally Schirra, and Walt Cunningham fly the redesigned spacecraft into Earth orbit. For 11 days, they put the command module through its paces.
Apollo 7 completed every one of the flight test objectives and a few more. It was a mission that was accomplished flawlessly. The spacecraft performed in an exemplary fashion.
Apollo is back on track. But distant events are about to impact mission control. CIA satellite photos reveal Russia has a moon rocket of its own, ready to launch. August 1968. CIA satellite photos show a huge Russian rocket nearly ready to launch.
The CIA came rushing in. They had a picture of the vehicle on its way to the pad. It was obvious they were going after something big. And what could it be but the circumlunar flight?
An American circumlunar flight, going around the moon without landing, isn't scheduled till next year. Now NASA management makes a daring change. The next flight, Apollo 8, will go all the way around the moon.
My initial belief was this was absolutely crazy. But I realized that risk had to be taken if we were to achieve Kennedy's goal of landing on the moon within the decade.
It will be the ultimate test for the mathematicians in the trench, navigating a spacecraft toward a moving target 250,000 miles away.
We were used to just going around the planet, and this was the first time that we were going to take people and send them to a destination.
Apollo 8 will also be the first time men ride the giant Saturn V moon rocket.
that was going to be the long pole in the tent. That big Hummer that had to get us out of the atmosphere, everybody knew that one was going to have to be done right.
It overpowered you. To me, this was the greatest miracle of technology associated with the entire Apollo program.
Taller than a 30-story building, the Saturn V weighs 6 million pounds. Just handling it takes a collection of huge, complex devices, each a marvel of engineering. To move it, a self-propelled platform bigger than a baseball diamond. To service it, a tower taller than the UN building in New York. 9 movable swing arms carry it electricity and fuel. Each weighs 30 tons. Underneath it, a flame deflector, taller than a 6-story building, will keep the exhaust from bouncing back. Without it, the rocket would destroy itself. Hold-down arms keep it bolted to the pad until the engines reach full power. They must all release within 30 milliseconds of each other, or the rocket will tip over as it starts to move. By December 1968, the rocket is ready. Apollo 8 astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders are about to become the first humans to head for another planet. Gene Kranz can only watch. He's training for the next flight.
I was sitting out Apollo 8, and this is probably one of the times in my life when I really appreciated being in the sideline during the course of the mission, because I had the ability to feel every emotion. I didn't have to suppress it like the guys on the console.
20 seconds and counting. 15
December 21st, at 6:51 a.m., the beast comes to life. Except for a nuclear bomb, the noise of the Saturn V is the loudest man-made sound on Earth. The hold-down arms release, and 6 million pounds of rocket begins rising.
Every controller held their breath because we want that guy to fly.
Power clear.
2 hours, 50 minutes after launch, translunar injection, TLI.
Apollo 8, you are go for TLI.
For the first time, humans will leave the gravity of the Earth and head for deep space.
Ignition. Roger, ignition.
I had this visceral feeling that we have left Earth orbit going to a place that a human had never been before.
Apollo 8, Houston, you're looking good here, right down the center line. Roger, Apollo 8.
We see the trajectory path change from basically going around the Earth now to forming a figure-8 type maneuver. We're outward bound to the moon. We'd seen it only in training before. I'd never seen it for real, nor in any controller.
Safe journey, guys.
Now physics takes over. The spacecraft is coasting, the moon advancing. In 2 days, their paths will intersect. Then another new unknown, lunar orbit insertion. If the LOI engine burn isn't just right, Apollo 8 could spin out into the solar system or crash into the moon.
As we approached the moon, everybody's anxiety, started raising because we knew that we were about to do something that was irreversible. We're just sitting there waiting. It's like waiting for a funeral to start.
You have one engine that has to work perfectly, and if that engine doesn't work, you're not going into orbit around the moon, or if you're in orbit around the moon, you're not coming back home.
Apollo 8, Houston, trajectory and guidance look good. Over.
The engine burn will happen behind the moon, out of radio contact. Until Apollo 8 reappears, no one on Earth will know if the trench's equations are right.
See you on the other side. Apollo 8. Apollo 8.
Christmas Eve, 1968. Astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders in Apollo 8 have just disappeared behind the moon. While they're on the other side, they'll perform a critical engine burn. The trench has calculated the exact instant Apollo 8 should reappear.
If the engine burn was successful, then they'd come around at this time and we'd see them. And if they didn't do the maneuver, then they would be early.
We've heard nothing yet, but we're standing by.
To the second, we saw that clock at 0. We heard the call, and we knew the crew had performed the perfect maneuver. We were now in orbit around the moon.
It's Apollo 8 now in lunar orbit. There's a chair in this room.
For the first time, humans have arrived only 60 miles from another planet.
I think the best way to describe this area is a vastness of black and white. Absolutely no color.
Then the crew, and everyone watching on Earth, sees something else.
That was indescribable. If you didn't experience that, you've missed something. You see it now, and you can make up that picture on any computer. But that was real, and it meant a lot to me, and it meant a lot, I think, to every human being on Earth that saw it.
And then they did the unbelievable. I just couldn't believe it.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
They started reading from the book of Genesis. And this was on Christmas Eve.
And the earth was without form and void. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God called the firmament heaven.
This was the surprise. Everything else had been pre-planned. And I was crying. It was so beautiful. And right now, this time, I really find it hard to suppress, the emotion of that instant. It's real for everybody who was there, who lived it.
Waters called he seas. God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
To hear that coming from Americans circling the moon on Christmas Eve, very emotional moment, very proud moment.
Apollo 8 is a turning point in history, giving humankind its first look at our home as it really is. In early 1969, 2 more Apollo flights, 9 and 10, test the lunar lander. By June, Apollo 11, the first moon landing attempt, is only 4 weeks away. Behind the scenes at Mission Control, Gene Kranz's team is training, simulating the landing.
The simulations were so real that no controller could discern the difference between the training and the real mission.
Astronauts are in a mock spacecraft, controllers at their consoles. When the sim begins, the mission is played out as if for real, following a script created by the simulation team, a script designed to uncover weakness.
They would start out with a normal mission so we could see that. After that, the rules were off. They would throw in any kind of failure we might be able to have.
The sim guys were devious people. They would give you a red herring to send you off sideways here and get you distracted And then come the bomb buster, you know, hit you, kaboom.
Only a month before the real landing, Krantz's sims are not going well.
It seemed we couldn't do anything right. We'd crash into the surface of the moon. We'd abort unnecessarily. Our bosses would call us up on the phone and they'd say, "Hey, what's going on down there?"
By July 5th, they're out of time. There's one final sim before launch.
Final simulation is essentially graduation day. It's one where you want everything to go exactly right and you want to leave the crew and the control team feeling good about this mission.
The sim begins. In charge of the landing computer on the lunar module, the LEM, is Guidance Officer Steve Bales. Halfway through the sim, the computer sounds an alarm.
This alarm should never come up. So I called an abort.
Capcom, we're no Roger, you are no go, no go.
I thought we had done the right thing. My controllers thought they had done the right thing. But the simulation supervisor came in and said, "No, you didn't do the right thing. You had that computer program alarm, but the computer was still functioning correctly."
According to the sim supervisor, Krantz's team aborted unnecessarily.
As a team, we had failed our final training day, and this was bad news.
In a little more than a week, Apollo 11 will depart for the moon, and Gene Krantz's team is not ready. July 1969, 10 days before the launch of Apollo 11. The final simulation has uncovered a problem with the landing computer. Gene Krantz wants Steve Bales to clear it up.
Gene said, "Look, I want you to go work on computer alarm rules, and I want to have an answer before the week's over. What are we going to do if this alarm comes up?"
The computer designers assure Bales the alarm can't happen in actual flight, but if it somehow does, it will be his decision whether or not to continue the landing.
Today, mankind will attempt
mission control in Houston reports everything is
America's
go
moonshot,
for today's
our first chance to set foot on another world.
2 weeks later, the first moon landing is about to begin. Gene Krantz's entire life has led him to this moment.
Of all of the flight directors, I'm probably the most emotional, and I felt compelled to talk.
I said, "We're getting ready to make history."
We're getting ready to make history. You know what we're about to do.
From the day that we were born, we were destined to be in this room this day.
I have
absolute confidence in everyone in this room, but I want you to know something.
No matter what happens to us this day, I will stand behind every decision that you make.
However it goes.
However it goes. When we walk out of this room, we walk out of this room as a team. I can't even say that today without getting choked up about it. That was the best thing he could have said to me.
And I said, "Lock the control room door." And from that moment forward, no one would enter or leave this room until we had either landed, we had aborted, or we had crashed.
Krantz checks with every controller before starting the landing.
Okay, all flight controllers, go for powered descent. Retro, go. Fido, go. Guide, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Econ, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, word go for powered descent.
A 250,000 miles away, astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin start down in the LEM.
Eagle, he said, looks good. Eagle, Houston, everything's looking good here, over.
Then, only a minute into the descent, Steve Bales, call sign Guidance, sees they're going down too fast.
20 foot per second, down back here.
If the air increases, they could crash.
Steve Bales comes to me and he says, "Flight, we're halfway to our abort limit."
So I was terrified. I thought I was going to have to stop the landing.
How you looking, guys? They're out 20 foot per second. No change is what you're saying. No change. Roger.
No change. The speed stays within abort limits.
And I thought my big problem for the day was over.
But in fact, Bale's big problem is about to begin.
1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm.
1201, the computer alarm that is never supposed to happen in actual flight. The same one from the final sim.
I'd forgotten what 1201 was. My backroom, who knows everything, has reminded me, that's the one where you've got to make a choice.
Bales is 25 years old. He has seconds to decide. Continue with an overloaded computer or abort.
If we ever aborted a lunar descent, it would have been the most complicated maneuver we've done in human spaceflight.
Time is running out. Bales makes his choice.
I said, flight, we're go. I almost shouted it.
We're going, that alarm. Go! Roger. Real good. Roger.
The computer is hanging on by a thread. And now there's another issue.
All of the problems that have occurred now are causing us to land long.
They've overshot the landing zone. Boulders as big as houses are in the way. Searching for a safer spot, Neil Armstrong is running out of fuel.
We wanted to have a margin at the end when we landed. We didn't want to land empty. In all of the sims, always, we had something on the order of 3 minutes of fuel left.
3 minutes. Altitude still over 500 feet. The math doesn't look good.
I said, okay, all flight controllers, no more calls except for fuel remaining.
Okay, the only call out from now on will be fuel.
Then Bob Carlton in the systems row makes a fuel call no one wants to hear.
Low level?
Low level. This means that now the gas gauge on board the spacecraft is virtually reading empty.
Boy, I clutched. The back room clutched. The whole control center clutched.
The next fuel call will be 60 seconds.
I started a stopwatch, and I sat there and watched that watch count down. And it come time to 60 seconds.
60 seconds.
Look at that altitude. We're never supposed to see this. The impossible has happened. We're not going to make it.
He calls off 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
I'm still counting. When he hits 0, it is now land or abort, one or the other.
Picking up some dust.
I thought, picking up dust? How can you be picking up dust? And then it dawned on me, we might make it.
About the time that he now calls off 15 seconds, we hear the crew going through the process of shutting down the engines.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We've had shut down. Control both autos, engine command override off.
Suddenly, the engineers of Mission Control, the masters of preparation, find themselves completely unprepared for what is said next.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
I'd never heard the words Tranquility Base before. In every simulation and every training, they continued to call themselves the Eagle even after they'd landed. Incredible name, I think. What an incredible name.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
And then the back room literally erupted. The people were pounding on the floor, cheering, applauding us. And then my control room started picking up the same buzz. And I said, okay, all you guys, settle down.
Okay, keep the chatter down in this room. Come on, let's keep the chatter down.
I said, guys, settle down, settle down. Keep your eye on the dadgum bird. This ain't over with. Keep your eye on it.
Outside the control center, the world celebrates. Inside, the mission goes on. Crew and spacecraft must be watched over, systems checked. Gene Kranz has another countdown to a decision. Is it safe to stay on the moon? It's just another moment in a busy, busy shift.
Now, flight controller is about 45 seconds to T1, stay no stay. 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 Stay no stay.
The first moon landing was an experience shared by millions. Ironically, some of the few who missed it were the very people who made it happen.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
That instant, we missed. And this team I felt so emotionally attached to that I just wished we could go back to that time and place and just do it one more time, only this time, really enjoy the moment rather than having to be so darn busy.
Everyone in Mission Control assumed that this would go down in history as their finest hour. They had no way of knowing that an even greater challenge lay just ahead, a challenge that would take them to the brink of disaster. November 1969. NASA has met their deadline, landing on the moon before the end of the decade. But Mission Control cannot rest on its laurels. The flights that follow will be just as challenging, just as dangerous.
Before every flight, our job was to train and simulate, to be ready for anything. Once we launched, our job changed. Then, it was all about problem solving.
The most critical time is launch, powered flight. With a crew riding on 6 million pounds of high explosives, controllers don't have much time to solve problems.
During powered flight, the mission decision process operated in around a 20-second time frame. Most people would think of 20 seconds as a blink of an eye. In Mission Control, it was a lifetime.
November 14, 1969, Apollo 12. Astronauts Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon, and Alan Bean are headed for the second moon landing. The need to make a fast decision is about to fall on controller John Aaron. He's in charge of electrical and environmental systems. His call sign, ECOM.
The thing that makes a good ECOM is a natural curiosity about how things work, even if you are not responsible for them.
2, 1.
Ignition.
Apollo 12 lifts off. It's Jerry Griffin's first launch as flight director.
And all of a sudden, everything, all the data went away, and there was a big static in my headset.
What the hell was that?
I said, ECOM, what do you see?
I looked down at all of my telemetry data, the readouts from the spacecraft, and they were nonsensical.
In the spacecraft, astronaut Alan Bean has no clue either.
Just lost the platform, gang. I don't know what happened.
Lights pop on. The alarm system comes on. More lights than I'd ever seen in the simulator. I mean, there was main bus A, main bus B.
I got 3 fuel cell lights, an AC bus light, a fuel cell disconnect, AC bus overload, 1 and 2, main bus A and B out.
It's an electrical failure. The command module has lost main power. Emergency batteries take over, but they'll only last 2 hours. Mission Control is facing a launch abort, jettison the spacecraft, and blow up the Saturn V. Now John Aaron's curiosity pays off. A year earlier, during a test, he had seen a strange pattern of data and had learned about an obscure switch inside the command module that could fix it.
I had seen that pattern before, and it had been 1 year since I had seen it. But it was like that pattern was written in my mind.
The Saturn V's engines keep burning, but the command module on top of the rocket is barely alive, powered only by emergency batteries. Everyone expects ECOM to abort. Then Aaron makes a different call.
I said, flight, tell them to take the SCE to aux.
Flight comes out, SCE to aux.
And I said, what?
Say again, SCE to aux.
SCE to aux.
I said, what's that?
It was some obscure switch, signal conditioning electronics to auxiliary.
I turned to the Capcom and Jerry Carr, and I said,
SCE to aux, Capcom.
And Carr said, what?
Mission Control comes back and says,
Try SCE to auxiliary, over. NCE to auxiliary. SCE to auxiliary. What the hell is that? SCE to auxiliary.
It turned out Al Bean knew where that switch was. It was back over his shoulder. He threw the switch and we got all of our data back and we could see what the problem was.
We got it back, flight. Looks good. Okay.
Later analysis reveals Apollo 12 had been hit by lightning, which traveled down the rocket's exhaust to the ground, knocking the spacecraft's main electrical system offline. The obscure SCE switch wasn't designed for this situation, but it works.
thank God for mission control. Thank God for mission control. I didn't have any idea what to do.
Pete Conrad broke out in nervous laughter.
You know what it did? I know what it is.
He laughed all the way into orbit.
I never saw somebody light up the pillar so many lights before I couldn't read them all.
Apollo 12 went on to make the second moon landing. In the control center, John Aaron's call, SCE to aux, became legendary.
If you took a poll of all of the people and asked them who is the most capable flight controller to ever sit in mission control, I think the majority of them would say John Aaron.
Five months later, Apollo 13 astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes are on their way to the moon. After 2 successful landings, Mission Control is confident.
We were feeling pretty good about what we did, although a lot of us had a lot of guarded humble, because it's dangerous business.
How dangerous will soon become clear. No one realizes it, but there is a ticking time bomb aboard Apollo 13. Inside a liquid oxygen tank, there is a heater and fan to stir up the super-cold mixture. Unknown to everyone, the wiring is damaged. April 13, 1970, nearly 56 hours into the flight. Gene Kranz's team is about to go off shift. Before they do, they request a cryostir. Turn on the oxygen tank fan.
13, we'd like you to stir up your cryo tank.
Okay, stand by. Houston, we've had a problem here.
Config in, please.
All right, Houston, we've had a problem. The main bus undervolt.
Main bus undervolt, a power failure. No one knows it, but the bad wiring in the oxygen tank 2 has caused an explosion. At first, the astronauts in Mission Control think it's only a power failure.
My initial gut reaction was, hey, we're going to solve this problem, get back on track, and then keep driving towards the moon.
Then astronaut Jim Lovell reports something even worse.
Now, looks to me, looking out the hatch, that we are venting something.
Crew thinks they're venting something.
We are venting something out into space.
To this day, I don't know why I did it, but I looked out the window, the side window, and I could see escaping at a high rate of speed a gaseous substance. We were losing our oxygen.
And this now triggered me to a survival mode, when the only thought on your mind is survival and you're trying to find a way to make it for the next few minutes.
They don't understand what's wrong. All they know is they're losing oxygen and power.
Okay, now let's everybody keep cool. Let's solve the problem, but let's not make it any worse by guessing.
But they can't solve it. The command module's power is dying. They switch to emergency batteries, but these will only last a few hours. Kranz orders Ecom Cy Liebergott, in charge of electrical and environmental systems, to get help.
Ecom, have you called in your backup Ecoms now? See if we can get some more brain power in this thing? We got one here. Roger.
One of the first backup Ecoms to arrive is John Aaron.
I watched what they were doing a few times. I said, guys, you're wasting our emergency batteries. We're going to have to power the command module down and turn it off.
I'd like you to go down that power down procedure until you get it.
That was a big, big step. It never powered down a command module or any of the major spacecraft.
That's right.
They have no choice. The emergency batteries will soon run out, and they need them for re-entry. To save them, they'll have to turn off the command module, their mothership.
It became apparent that the inevitable was facing us, that we were going to lose this mothership.
The crew moves into the lunar lander, the LEM. It will be their lifeboat. The command module, the only piece that can bring them home, is turned off to save its batteries.
Now we know there's no more going to the moon. We also know it's going to be damn tough, maybe impossible, to get this crew back home.
NASA reacts like any family after an accident. All over America, phones begin ringing. At contractors' offices and mission control, engineers not on shift come in to get the latest news, to help, or just be there.
I'll never forget it going run up those steps. I didn't know what was going on. I said, man, I bet you I'll never be the same when I come out of this place. I knew it, and I wasn't.
At this moment, Gene Kranz calls his mentor, Chris Kraft.
I knew it was serious when I walked into the room. The electricity was here, the smoke was here, the environment was here, that these guys were under the gun.
And he walked to me at the console. I was busy, and I says, Chris, we're in deep shit.
April 1970, 200,000 miles from Earth, Apollo 13 is crippled, the crew's survival in doubt. After losing its power, the command module has been turned off. Astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes huddle in the lunar lander. It can keep them alive, but with no heat shield or parachutes, it can't bring them home.
That can't be.
If we didn't come up with some answers darn quick, not only wouldn't there be a landing, this crew might not come back to Earth.
If the crew can be saved, it will take the entire mission control team.
In the trench, it was our job to speed up their return back to Earth. The systems guys then had to figure out how they could get their systems to sustain life on board their spacecraft for as long as they could.
An hour after the explosion, Gene Kranz's team goes off shift. Glenn Lunny comes on. One of his first steps is a critical engine burn. Without the burn, Apollo 13 will swing around the moon, miss the Earth, and remain in space forever.
My choice was to go ahead and get it done so to give at least that sense of comfort to the team and to the crew.
We're burning 40%. Okay, Aquarius, you're looking good.
The burn works. At least the spacecraft is on a path that will take it back to Earth.
It was still a long way from being home, but we'd taken our first step, big step, back out of this hole.
Glenn was the one who sort of restored order to the room and got us thinking on an even keel.
Throughout NASA and at contractors all across America, engineers try to figure out how to stretch power, water, consumables. In the lunar module, the LEM, the astronauts hunker down, keeping lights and heat off to save batteries.
There wasn't enough thermal blankets, so this thing cooled down. So I got a lower urinary tract infection, chills and fever. Of course, the chills part got very bad with the temperature environment we had.
As Fred Hayes gets sicker and sicker, temperatures drop near freezing. In Mission Control, Gene Kranz has assembled his team in a back room.
I said, okay, everybody listen up. We have never lost an American in space, and we sure as hell aren't going to lose one now. You have to believe it, your team has to believe it, and we are the ones that must make it happen.
The key will be powering up the dead command module. Only it has the heat shield and parachutes for re-entry.
This was a cold cutoff, and it was going to be a cold startup in space. And that had never been done before. So that's what his team had to go figure out. How do you do that?
The command module's batteries have only 2 hours, so it will have to be turned on at the last minute, just before re-entry, without wasting a drop of battery power.
This whole thing came down to electricity. Electricity was the constraining resource.
So I elected John Aaron to basically become the power manager for the remainder of the mission.
Krantz's team struggles to figure out how to power up a frozen spacecraft on a shoestring. Every engineer wants his system on, but John Aaron knows there won't be enough electricity to go round.
I'll never forget the landing and recovery guide. I was not going to turn on the emergency rescue beacon. He says, oh, you can't do that. You can't do that. If you don't turn that beacon on and they don't come down exactly where we're wanting, we'll never find those guys. I said, look, guys, my only job is to find an ocean, to hit any ocean. If I can get them in the ocean, surely you can find them. That was the level of negotiations that went on for the next 3 days.
Krantz's controllers work for 3 days and nights, planning a complicated power-up that's never been done before.
At the very last moment, I have to evacuate from the lunar module, rapidly power up the command module, initialize the computer, close the hatches, assure I'm in the proper orientation, then blow the pieces apart. This is a checklist that's going to be several hundred steps long.
It was getting tight, and so I started to query mission control. Is the checklist ready? Is the checklist ready?
Finally, Krantz's team has the plan.
So the standard entry checklist on page 2-2, where it starts with P61.
Page 2-2, where we...
The emergency batteries come back to life. The crew jettisons the service module to begin re-entry. Then they see the damage.
And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing.
We were quite concerned. We couldn't believe that this thing drifting by was our spacecraft.
Everyone now realizes the explosion was only a few feet away from the heat shield. Even the slightest crack in that shield, and Apollo 13 may disintegrate during re-entry.
We didn't talk much about it because there was nothing we could do about it.
Re-entry begins, and with it, radio blackout. Will 13 burn up from a damaged heat shield? Will the frozen parachutes open? Mission Control won't know until blackout ends.
Now, blackout is a very difficult time for every controller because we've done everything that we humanly can, and now there are no more give-backs.
The trench has calculated the exact second blackout should end, and they'll be able to hear the crew again, if they're still alive.
The clock counted down through 0.
And I say, okay, Joe, give him a call. And Kerwin calls, Odyssey Houston, standing by.
Odyssey Houston, standing by, over.
Apollo 13, this is Houston.
13, do you read? This is Houston, over.
Nothing.
I said, Retro, are the clocks right? And he says, yeah, Flight, they're right.
Is this it? Is this all there is?
Damn it, we got these guys back and that heat shield has failed. My gosh, where have you been?
Odyssey Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
The most beautiful sight I've ever seen is that command module dangling on those 3 chutes.
I was crying. It was really hard to stop from crying at that time. And I sit down at the chair and I rub my eyes because I'm embarrassed in front of my team to let them know that I've lost it.
The rescue of Apollo 13 was Mission Control's finest hour. When these engineers said, "Failure is not an option," that wasn't just a slogan. They meant it literally.
When something bad happened, it was the job of each person in the control center to analyze what all of the options were. How do we get out of this? Look at all of the options, and failure was not one of them.
But there was no engineering option to repair loss of public support and political will. In December 1972, Apollo 17 ended the greatest exploration in human history.
I never look at the moon without thinking that we have been there. I never look at the moon without thinking that it was a miracle that we got there.
When I was a kid, and if somebody wanted to express something so impossible, it is beyond comprehension, they'd say, "You can't anymore do that, then you can go to the moon." And there's the moon.
To this day, I go out at night and I relive that moment when I saw the crescent moon, knowing that people were walking around on it. And I yearn for the day for that to be the natural thing again.
Could we do it again? Could we, America, really do that again? It took a very clear goal mandated by the president, the backing of the Congress, the backing of the citizenry, and a bunch of stupid guys like me that didn't know that it couldn't be done.
Today, the original Mission Control room is silent, but it is not empty.
Every time you walk in that door, you can feel the events of the past.
I feel extremely proud of what we were able to do. I feel the pangs of terror that all of us faced. So I feel all of those emotions when I enter this palace.
This console here was the best part of my entire life. And I spent almost 10 years at this console. It is my life. It will always be my life. And I will never leave it behind.
After the Apollo program, Gene Kranz remained at NASA for 22 more years, through the triumphs of Skylab, the Space Shuttle, the Hubble Space Telescope, and the tragedy of the Challenger. Today, he and all the others who pioneered the art of flight control have retired. But the torch has been passed to a new generation of mission controllers, cut from the same cloth, imbued with the same spirit. Setbacks are inevitable. Like the original Brotherhood of Controllers was tested by the Apollo 1 fire, today's controllers are also being tested. But just as nothing could end man's exploration of Earth, so too will the grand adventure of space continue. And whatever distant places future generations aim for, they will be carrying on a journey that had its start at a place called Mission Control.